Thank you very much for your patience and for accepting our invitation. So, Oliver, before we start our interview, let's break the ice with a few short questions. My first one is, how would you describe your work in one sentence?
Yeah, hi, Viviana. Thanks for having me. The way I would talk about my work really is I'm really interested in improving relationships between humans and non-humans and helping nature in its amazing ability to repair itself.
Okay. And how would you describe the impact that you would like your work to have in our environment?
Um, well, uh, to badly paraphrase Marx, I would say artists have often interpreted the world or depicted the world. My ambition is to change it. I want my work to be I want my work to be the environment, not to be about the environment.
Okay, thank you. And last short question, how would you describe the future as you see it in one sentence?
Well, the future is already here, but unevenly distributed. I think it was like William Gibson who said that. And I think what we're going to be seeing is far more consequences of climate change. I mean, that's really kicking in. And also the diminishment of what we call wilderness, and also an expansion of what we call ruderal or ruin ecologies, post-industrial ecologies.
Okay, and let's talk about now your projects. Which one do you consider the mission of your life? Especially in
That,
the...
that's a tough question. You know, I was thinking about that. And I guess the ones I am the most, that I remember and perhaps have done the most good in the world have been my public art projects that I was working on predominantly in the city of Vancouver in Canada. And I did a project, two projects there actually, that I could talk about. The one, it was a community garden, and the other one was a project called The Means of Production, which was a urban biomaterials plantation where people could grow their own stuff for basketry. And then I see there's an image there of another project I did called Healing the Cut, which was basically putting a forest in a place where there was some serious damage due to construction. So it's become part of the city. So those are projects that are now, yeah, oh, I see. There's the means of production on the left there. Those projects are kind of living projects in a sense that they're being taken care of by people and they have whole ecosystems associated with them. And so they're going to far outlive anything that they'll outlive me. And they're like a kind of just a permanent part of the landscape now that, I mean, it functions as art, but it also just functions as a whole hub of relationships.
This is a question that just occurs to me. What do you think is the path for projects like this to become not an exclusion, but a role, especially in terms of urban planning?
Yeah, there's more of that happening. I mean, since I've been an artist since the early 1980s, there's far more acceptance, I think, by a new generation of urban planners to include artists, particularly what you would call social practice artists and ecological artists in the sort of design of the city. And I mean, of course, it varies from place to place. Vancouver at that point had a very forward-looking public art program, and I know other cities do as well. So the role of the artist is not just to decorate the cities, but actually to improve the way people and non-humans relate to each other, and to create these kind of relational spaces. So that's I think there is a shift in urban planning, certainly in some of the larger cities to accommodate this.
That's good to know. I hope that more cities will be like this. So talking about cities and urban design, let's talk about your teaching at the Parsons School of Design. There you had a very interesting task for your students to redesign a public space in New York, but taking into consideration the non-human livings who inhabit the space. So tell us a little bit more about this project.
Yeah, it's an ongoing project that I do with my students every semester. I teach a course called Sustainable Systems, which sort of takes into account a lot of, how not to kill the planet for designers. So this project is called Becoming Non-Human, Designing Non-Human. And so we dress up and we pretend we're not human, and then we interview each other, and then we try to design things or landscapes from the point of view of a non-human. So in this image here, there's some students pretending they're not human on the left, and on the right is a redesign of a park in New York City in the East Village called Tompkins Square Park from the point of view of a rat. Now, how might a rat like that park to be designed? And the student didn't love rats. I mean, we're all a bit, very few people like them, but there's so many rats in New York, and the idea that can we coexist with these rats, because the rats probably don't like us either. So she reimagined the design of the park from the point of view of not people, but of these rats. And she actually designed garbage cans that the rats could eat. And here's another project where there was a student of mine in China who was very worried about cats, and how feral cats were always pregnant and they seemed miserable. So she designed birth control for feral cats so that they wouldn't be pregnant all the time and have a better life, because it was exhausting for them to constantly be having kittens. So, we may not care about the feral cat, but the feral cat, they want to be comfortable. And how would it be like if the cat was your client and walked into your design office and said, can you give me better birth control? So this is the project. There's many, many versions. Some people design things from the point of view of a tree or any other kind of organism, a fish in a river. And it's been a very, very good exercise, because it creates this sort of sense of intersubjectivity where the student takes into account the user experience of the non-human, and that creates a far more sort of sustainable and also more compassionate outcome in the design process.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. To be honest, I'd love to take part in such a class. I know
it's a lot of fun.
I'm sure, and totally eye-opening. So tell us a little bit more about your projects in which you actually use microorganisms to consume pollutants, to convert waste into biomaterials, to biodegrade styrofoam. So tell us a little bit more about this. Is this the direction in which we should go in terms of recycling?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, one of the issues of the Anthropocene is, we generate all of these synthetic materials like plastic. Of course, they create enormous environmental damage, as we know, microplastics and whatnot. But there are parallel processes of evolution where living systems are adapting to our waste stream. And I find that very interesting and hopeful. So this is a project called Plastivore, where I use mealworms. These are just common insects that you use to feed birds or pet reptiles. And they actually can digest a styrofoam, which is polystyrene, and through symbiotic gut bacteria. So they eat the styrofoam and then convert it into food. So it actually composts the styrofoam, and I've turned it into an art project. So there's a version there on the upper left, which is a big stomach filled with styrofoam. This was on display in Melbourne, Australia last year, and it has the styrofoam. People bring in the styrofoam and it gets digested into compost. And on the bottom left is an example of, a styrofoam cup, a common takeout cup, that I actually collect these objects after the worms have partially digested them. And I find them very interesting because they remind me of these scholar's stones or philosopher's stones that are common in East Asian gardens and spaces of contemplation. So even plastic, I mean, we talk about how permanent it is, but it has a kind of, I think there's a contemplative opportunity there in plastic. My father worked in a styrofoam factory, so I have a sort of fondness for styrofoam, even though it's a horrible material and a very destructive material. So I'm kind of really fascinated by my relationship to the material, but then the non-humans as well. So these insects can digest it. There's also work I've been doing with fungi to break down common materials, like, for example, We have at Parsons, we have a wood shop like many other art schools, and a lot of the plywood is contaminated with glue. So I found a way to use common fungi to break down the glue contaminated cardboard and make little castings so the students can make little objects out of that. So fungi, I'm very interested in how they also have adapted to our waste stream. They can break down things like petroleum and some of the most noxious substances that we have produced. In fact, there's a fungus in Chernobyl in the sarcophagus that is adapted to the intense radiation of
Wow.
of the sarcophagus, and it's a radiotrophic fungus that absorbs radiation as an energy source. So these things are. I'm not saying we should continue contaminating the planet, but it is interesting to see how some organisms have adapted to our pollution.
Here comes then my next question.
The image is there. So there's the Venus of Willendorf made out of sawdust and floor sweepings and fungi. The middle are more of these contemplative styrofoam objects. And on the right is me holding fungus, oyster mushroom, we're using to absorb lead from contaminated soil on an industrial site in upstate New York.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for this explanation. This is where my next question comes. If nature can actually heal itself, and thus what can we do to help her?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes the best answer is nothing. Sometimes the answer is to do very little and just sit back and wait. And there's some images there of parking lots and various industrial sites when I mean, we've all seen these kind of places, they're around everywhere, particularly in the built environment. When something is abandoned for a while, nature takes over. And on the left, you can see these, cyanobacteria and mosses taking over a parking lot, and then eventually little trees form. So ultimately, buildings are just slow release fertilizer, and certainly plants, and then eventually animals too start to colonize the built environment. So sometimes by leaving things alone, that's fine. I'm really interested in how these processes unfold without a lot of human assistance. You can think of things going back to Chernobyl as well, that there's a lot of problems with Chernobyl, obviously, but it's also a great center of biodiversity. There's creatures there now that have been sighted that haven't been around for centuries because people have left the area, and so things like lynxes and bears and all kinds of exotic things are moving back. So sometimes doing less is more. But there are all times when we can help things along, by kind of, just being judicious. I mean, maybe put up a birdhouse or something. But I'm sort of a low impact guy when it comes to thinking about efforts to consciously remediate.
Understand. Then let's talk about the botanical interventions and the permacultural projects that you work on, about cottonwood community gardens. You said about them that they give you hope for the future. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so Cottonwood was a project that I was living in a very poor neighborhood in Vancouver, Canada, and the place was, a food desert. It was hard to get nutritious food. A lot of people were struggling with drugs and alcohol. Of course, in low-income neighborhoods, they tend to have a low green space per capita. So I started a project to take over vacant land and turn it into a garden. And we were essentially a squatters movement. And it was very interesting because, I'm an artist and I had some, knowledge, but not that much. And what happened soon was other people came forward and, helped me. And then we formed this community of gardeners who took over a wasteland and turned it into this lush place that is now one of the largest community gardens in Canada, but it's constantly being maintained. I don't know if you have an image of it there, but the first...
I was just about to ask my colleague that she can place the...
Okay, so there's a good image there. So these are that area. A lot of the folks were immigrants from China, and had grown up in sort of traditional sort of permacultural agro systems. So this gentleman, Austin Yu, actually was salvaging tofu curds from a tofu factory and digging them into this terribly, compacted soil from a place that used to be a dump. And he's actually turning the soil into a sort of food source for worms. And then with these kinds of permaculture interventions, this dump became incredibly fertile. And we started having mycelium in the soil, more worms. And now there's like fruit trees and ponds. And we even had eagles nesting in nearby trees. Yeah, in a heavily industrial site. So although you could call this social practice, in terms of the art sphere, it's much more than that. It's actually a whole ecosystem of people and place, and it goes on to this day. I mean, the garden was started in '92, and it's still flourishing after all these years. And people, that I don't even know are involved in taking such good care of it. So that's what gives me hope. I think people really do want to do the right thing, but I think you have to empower people by giving people the opportunity to do the right thing and, like controlling a little bit of their own environment without it being over-planned.
Here comes my next question in the context of what you just said. Obviously, nature really can help us protect and make the environment better than it is now. Why don't we do this? You just said that actually people need to be empowered. So maybe a little bit of kind of political question, but yeah, why don't we actually empower people? Why don't we encourage them to do it, to help nature, to engage in more projects like those that we just talked about?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think you sort of hit the nail on the head with the word power. We have power relationships in all political systems, and one of the biggest power relationships in capitalism is the notion of property. So often people who are sort of at the low end of privilege, subaltern people who have marginalized for economic, racial reasons, tend to not have access to capital or property. So automatically they're outside the sort of privilege of agency over space, right? Because increasingly urban space anyways is largely controlled by capital. So as soon as you start taking over an empty lot and turning it into a urban farm, you're threatening the legitimacy of the power relationship. So there tends to be pushback, right? So that's why we have trouble with that. People want to do this. I mean, if all over the world, people are doing these kinds of things. It's but there's often constraints because some developer may want to use this land for private capital. So I think we've kind of lost the balance. I mean, obviously private property and all of that are an important part of global economic systems, but we also need to provide spaces where people can kind of do these, what we would call commoning processes, revivifying or rebringing back the commons, where people can just do stuff like this without it becoming commodified or turned into property. And these become social spaces that are not owned, but stewarded, right? So it requires a sort of risk. You want to be able to trust that people will do the right thing, and generally they do, in my experience, and create these wonderfully complicated and productive spaces.
Thank you. In terms of sustainability, what are the most important steps that we need to make, and also what are the biggest mistakes we had to stop making?
Well, one of the issues is the big project is always risky, like big dam projects or massive agricultural projects that cause massive harm. Most we've gotten away from incrementalism as a way of doing things and turned into these like grand gestures, which often cause huge problems. So scale is a big problem, and sustainability is all about small things and then assessing their effect, right? And also the lack of social, economic, and ecological justice. These are kind of moral situations. We've kind of externalize these things. It's like, well, you know, somebody might get displaced here, but really we need to make the money that we need to make. Or so we sort of lost our compassion. So I think regaining compassion, regaining a sense of incrementalism, and regaining a sense of social and ecological and economic justice are vital to sustainability. It's not just about the designs that we make. It's about the relationships we create and maintain.
Thank you. Again, a question that is in this context, which is the biggest sin of Anthropocene epoch? Which is your biggest disappointment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the biggest sin, I mean, if you want to use that word, mistake or delusion, is to treat nature as an externality. Like it's not external. We are it. It is us, right? We can't just sort of, you know, throw toxic material into nature and think it's some sort of external thing. There's also this idea of cheap nature, like, you know, we can cut down rainforests in Brazil or in Canada or pollute lakes in areas with as bad environmental regulations because nature's cheap. So we've cheapened nature. And that's something, that concept of it, you know, we've cheapened it, we've commodified it, and we've also externalized it. And I think those are the big sins that we've committed. So we need to realize that we can't externalize it. We're in it. It's us. It's not outside. It's everywhere. It's inside as well.
We'll talk about this a bit in a while, just in a second. You love to use the phrase, the Buddhist phrase, what can I do not? How can we transfer this in terms of urban planning, design, and in general, our attitude towards nature?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested in non-intervention, and you know, certainly in Western culture, there's a lot of emphasis put on, you know, idle hands do the devil's work and all these kinds of things. But sometimes by leaving things alone, they take care of themselves in interesting ways. You know, there's examples like the last time I was in Berlin, for example, there was one of the places where you can see the most European goshawks is around the Tempelhof airfield, which is an abandoned airfield. So just by leaving this airfield alone and not really doing all that much, these beautifully iconic, you know, wild raptors, these hawks have moved in just by doing nothing, right? And so doing nothing sometimes is a very powerful design tool. And also when it comes to like community gardening and urban agriculture, sometimes just letting people design their own spaces, non-professional people, non-expert people can do a very excellent job. Now I see in the image there's a project where I did something, but not very much. So this was this eroded hillside, and I put up some birdhouses to attract birds and planted a few little things. But really what happened was the birds did all the work. The birds brought in seeds. The birds brought in, you know, nutrients in their droppings, which created this forest, which I now call an artwork. But my collaborators were actually birds, and they did most of the work. I didn't have to plant all these trees. I just had to make conditions ready for them to do it. So by doing very little, a lot got done. But the forest fixed itself. I just helped, you know. I didn't plant everything. I didn't make a grand gesture. I just made a little start.
That's amazing. That's really amazing, and it's kind of opens the door to the next question about Arturo Escobar and his book Designs for the Pluriverse. I know that it's really important for you, that you like it and you like this concept. So let's talk about this connection between all of us, and it's really going to be interesting for our readers, for our audience.
Yeah,
for me.
That was a great book that recently came out, Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar, and he talks about design being, you know, sort of intersubjective and entangled, and taking into account all stakeholders, so that you know, you're not just designing from one point of view, you're designing from, you know, multiple subjectivities, right? So that the things you do aren't just, you know, for you, they affect the world. So it's a very interesting approach the pluriverse as a kind of set of subjectivities that we need to be responsible towards. We exist in a pluriverse. So it's a great concept. And it also deals with the ethics of design really, really well. Like, you know, who are we leaving out? Why are we leaving out this tree on the corner, or this bird on the you know, chimney, or this or these homeless people who we don't want to think about, you know? Like, why do we leave these people out when we design this building, you know? So it's a very powerful concept, and it's kind of congruent with some of these other ideas of Buddhism and intersubjectivity and interbeing. Really, we're all together in this kind of existence in this pluriverse. So I think he really nails it. It's a great book for your audience to follow up on.
Thank you. And let's talk now about your New Eocene project and the future of Earth's forest. It's really interesting, and I'll be happy if you talk about it.
Well, so the big, you know, issue that we've all been worrying about and experiencing is climate change. And we know, like, global heating, climate change is kind of a watering down of what's really going on. The world is getting hotter. And so one of the issues is where I was spending time in Canada, the forests are actually under stress. They are burning more regularly. We've all heard about the horrible wildfires this summer in the Pacific Northwest and in California. So increasingly climate's changing. And even trees in protected areas like national parks and whatnot are all suffering. Some of the big trees like sequoias are dying in their California range. It's just too hot and dry. So, oh, great, you've got the slide up. So a few years ago, actually over 10 years ago, I started working with the botanist and scientist Rupert Sheldrake and his son Merlin, who just wrote a book on fungi, which has been very popular, to take a piece of land. It was an industrially clear-cut piece of land in British Columbia, so it had been completely logged over. It was just a barren piece of land. To plant trees on the land, but instead of planting the trees that were logged off, we had this concept that we would plant prehistoric trees. Now, obviously, a lot of prehistoric trees are extinct, but some are still around, and some trees live much further south now than they did in prehistory. So in the middle of the screen there is a fossil of a redwood tree that was found in northern Canada, right? And because back the last time it was as hot as it's going to get in the next 100 years was 55 million years ago in the Eocene, hence the name of the piece. So what would it be like to plant redwoods and ginkgos and sort of subtropical trees at a northern latitude, knowing that the climate was going to shift towards warmer conditions, right? And so we did this. We started planting hundreds of redwood trees and sequoia trees, which are native to California, way up north of the 50th parallel in Canada, and also some more unusual trees, like kind of living fossils. And they all did very well, which was very interesting. They didn't really get any care. They were just stuck in the ground in this industrial clear cut. So this idea that we can adapt the landscape by helping the migration of plants, like during the last warming period, these plants would have migrated on their own very incrementally. But we just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if we took some of these trees from the south and planted them in the north, just to see how they would do, and they did very well. So it's a problematic piece because we're making all kinds of assumptions as to whether this is even a good idea or not. We don't know. So it's an experiment, and so far so good. And it's a question, do we do this? I mean, do we start moving trees from southerly latitudes to northerly latitudes because they're starting to die? Like, do we move the sequoias, from the Sierra Nevadas to the Rocky Mountains because it's getting too hot in the Sierra Nevadas? It's an ethical question, and I actually don't know the answer. So the piece was an attempt to interrogate that question and to get people to think about it. And it's still growing, and these trees will get far older than I will. So at some point in the future, people will be able to, have the conversation as to whether we were on the right track or not.
I would ask you if you see this initiative as a global one. what do you think about it?
Yeah, and in fact, it is starting to happen. Currently, I'm in Massachusetts, and the local tree people here, the people responsible for the street trees, are planting trees from warmer areas on the streets because New England is getting hotter, and the iconic, sugar maples and the kinds of trees that New England is known for are not doing very well. So they're actually growing trees now on the streets that are from, areas like the Southern Appalachians, the Carolinas, the sort of Southeast, because they're doing better than the iconic New England species. So people who plant trees, urban arborists, have to sort of think in the 100-year time span, right? Because trees live a long time. So they're already making these adjustments. I know Chicago as well is changing the types of trees that they suggest be planted on the streets.
Thank you very much. Living in Chicago, I promise to check out on this. It's still not a news, so probably it's gonna really happen. I do hope though. So
yeah, they're just starting. I know because Chicago's historically quite a cold city, but now the summers are getting hotter, and they're changing the mix of the trees that they're planting.
Thank you. I'm definitely gonna search on this. One last question. What is your message to society for the upcoming year and the years to come?
That's such a great question. And I was thinking about it. I really think kindness, kindness is very important in all things, design, politics, the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to non-humans. Yeah, I think that's really the best thing is try to just be kind. And I tell my students this all the time, like, if nothing else, be kind, and kind design, kind interaction. I guess that's pretty much all I could come up with.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for our invitation, for accepting it, for being part of HMO Society, and hope to see you very soon. Thank you
once again. It's a pleasure. If people want to find out more about my work, they can go onto my website, very easy to remember, oliverk.org. So oliverk.org. And most of the projects are documented there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you, Gergana.
Have a great Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.